Hello, and welcome to another episode of Unworthy History. Today we got some more actual history for you from this book right here, The Capture and Escape Life Among the Sioux by Sarah Larimer. This book was published all the way back in 1870. So this is episode 6 in my series on the attack on Fanny Kelly's wagon train. Here, Sarah Larimer, the other woman with her, is going to relate a story that the Sioux war chief told to the young braves about his vengeful fight against the Comanches. Indians are very irregular in their habits of eating, surfeiting themselves when opportunity permits, and as they depend upon the precarious resources of chance and the chase in their predatory wanderings, sometimes remaining a remarkably long time before taking sustenance, but without apparent injury. Although these Indians had eaten no breakfast, dinner was not prepared, but in the process of unrolling and admiring their plunder, several bottles of medicine were discovered, which liquid they immediately proceeded to drink, but fearing the nauseating effect it might produce would cause them to believe that they were under the influence of poison, and to avenge their supposed wrong upon us, I immediately proceeded to explain to them the nature of the liquid, and they desisted. Several glass jars filled with pickles were discovered, opened and then tasted, with indescribable contortions of countenance. After a little serious reflection, however, it was decided that cooking would be likely to improve their flavor, and a fire was immediately prepared for the purpose of trying the experiments. Placing glass jars among the flames, the plan proved to be rather startling, for very soon they burst into pieces, scattering in all directions and letting the vinegar pour over the coals, the pickles simmering among the ashes. This was too great an imposition for the Indians. They were disappointed and indignant. Looking contemptuously at the fragments, they exclaimed in English, "White fool! Heap, white fool! Squaw! Squaw!" and further testified their disapprobation of the result of their protection of their admired package and their cookery by jumping around in much glee and almost frantic excitement. We had traveled about 40 miles to the northward. From our position, I believed the nearest point of the Platte River to be about 20 miles, and thought Fort Deer Creek was among the hills 10 miles beyond. During this encampment, I discovered several little books that had belonged to Frank, Wilson's series of readers, and I thought that, though in bondage, I saw useful work for me to do. The scriptural stories, so plainly and pleasantly told, aided this suggestion. So, attracting the attention of several of the most intelligent young men, I began to instruct them in a first lesson, and I was delighted at observing the aptitude and interest they manifested, as they repeated words and listened to explanations with pleased attention, seeming to realize the necessity of being able to read and write, and that benefit might be derived by correspondence with their white brethren. As a reward for my lesson in reading, they kindly offered to teach us a lesson in archery, and placing some blunt arrows and a strong bow in our hands, endeavored to show the manner of shooting, the distance an arrow shaft might pass into a body, etc., but we declined. The knowledge of the use of the bow is one of the earliest teachings given to Indian boys, and sometimes even it is taught to girls. In this instance, they undertook to show us both. Their conversation seemed altogether connected with shooting, cutting, scalping, and slaughtering generally. They kept their firearms in readiness for battle, anticipating attack from our pursuing friends, and bundles of arrows were placed convenient to their hands. The points of these instruments of death are sometimes made of flint, sometimes of bone, but usually of steel, the latter being often purchased of traders who make it their business to furnish them for the Indians. Poisoned arrows are the most deadly weapons the Indians use. The poison is prepared by imprisoning a venomous snake, exciting it to attack, and then thrusting the arrow point previously attached to a long stick into its mouth at the moment the reptile ejects poisonous saliva. The arrow thus envenomed having once entered the flesh of a person, all hope is over. The sting is not remediable by medicine, and death is the only relief for which the unfortunate victim can hope. Happening to discover a comb, many of them straighten their hair, and finally offer the instrument to me. Though I would have preferred my own comb, I feared to refuse theirs, and taking the pins from my long hair, it fell loosely over my shoulders. I was proceeding to smooth it when the chief noticed it, and regarded me with a darkening and dissatisfied frown. After a few moments of gloomy hesitation, he took a great knife from his belt, whetted it, examined the edge, and turning to his men, addressed them in a brief speech in their own language. Then, approaching me, he said, "I must take your hair." My fears had been aroused by his violent look and flourishing gestures when addressing his men, and now as the gleaming knife neared my head, remembering he had given me no assurance of personal kindness, and that his conduct toward his men through the morning had been expressive of a very cruel nature, I had but little hope of mercy at his hands. Frank lay sleeping by my side upon the ground. Surely some blessed angel soothed his slumbers, for had he awakened and seeing my danger cried out, his life would have been sacrificed, or we both might have fallen victims to the easily excited wrath of the chief. One Indian had seemed obliging, and another had been inclined to be communicative in English, and had given assurances of goodwill. I arose hastily, and going to the old man that could talk English, solicited his protection. He was also alarmed for my fate, and this unpleasant discovery increased my fears. Turning to their leader, he addressed him in their language in an earnest, pleading manner, by which I understood that the chief held supreme authority over his men. For a while the stern features retained their inflexible severity, but finally yielding under the influence of earnest pleadings, he replaced the knife in his belt and turned away. Though it was only my hair he had intended to sever, the Indian had caused me no trifling uneasiness, and I was inexpressibly relieved by his changed manner and action. This Indian, named Tokiche, though old, decrepit, and partially blind, was a great war chief, holding supreme control over several bands of his tribe. His authority being unquestioned, he was zealously obeyed, though from his inhuman disposition he was not loved by his warriors. 60 years of his life had been spent in rapacity and bloodshed. In his youth he had distinguished himself as the most daring warrior of his band, and while yet a boy had won renown upon the warpath by carrying his lance in defiance into the camp of the Crows and Shoshones. Being promoted to war chief for intrepid and successful conflict with the Pawnees and other tribes, he gained honor, and his power being increased, he even faced the Comanches in hostile encounter upon the Arkansas River. During the Minnesota War, he again dug up the hatchet, and with his young braves ravaged the border with more than usual success. His name had become a terror and a watch cry in Indian warfare. Nor were his cruelties confined to enemies, but extended into his private life, and it was his boast that very many men had fallen by his hands, and that his tepee was ornamented by pictures of the scalp locks of several of his wives, who had fallen victims to his jealous hatred. It being the duty of the chief in their encampments to instruct the youth, Tokiche, after smoking his pipe and offering it to several others, who in turn took a whiff, proceeded to tell the following story, which was translated by the kind old man to whom reference has been made. When I was a boy, scarce 12 years old, I had a friend, a boy of my own age, whose parents were dead. We were sincerely attached to each other and were companions in all our pursuits, and we often rode among the hills together, sometimes for pleasure and frequently to hunt, and often tried the speed of our animals in the valleys or upon the mountain sides. On one occasion, when riding over a huge pile of rocks while in pursuit of a deer, my friend's pony fell and rolled over the boy, breaking a leg and an arm of my friend. I dragged him from his painful position under the horse, and fearing to leave him alone, turned his pony loose and started it in the direction of our camp. The wounds were severe, rendering it impossible for the boy either to walk alone or to ride my horse, and as no assistance came to us, I waited 2 days, suffering meantime both hunger and thirst. Then my friend's agony became almost intolerable. I started for the village, and reaching a hill that overlooked it, I was surprised to see no traces of either tents or people. I was surprised that my friends would thus forsake me, and was considering what would be best to do, when a party of Comanches surrounded and captured me, taking an eastward direction. I was told that a war party had invaded our village, but that the people had all fled, taking their teepees with them. The humiliation of my position was indeed slight compared to the sufferings of my friend, as he lay alone, looking and longing for me, whom he would never doubt until death relieved him from his sufferings. How bitter must have been his disappointment as I failed to come! For years my dreams were haunted by his dying groans. I imagined I saw him lying prostrate with hunger, thirst, and his wound, and being torn and eaten by wolves, and as the spirit could bear no more, turn a last look for me, and I was not coming. This was more than I could endure. Through cunning and watchfulness I escaped from my captors, but the bones of my friend I never found. Returning to my own people, I promised the Great Spirit to avenge my imprisonment and my dear friend's death. Years later, when I had become a man, I sought out the people who had injured me, and taking with me a party of my own men, we invaded their village, scattering and slaughtering all that dared offer resistance. But this did not satisfy me, and soon after returning home we went again. But the Comanches, having been surprised and caused to suffer by our invasion, were preparing for defense, and we dared not enter their village, but instead we determined on a secret plundering expedition, and we succeeded each in stealing a young squaw. She who fell to my share was beautiful as a fawn. I loved her, and in time she became my wife, and I called her Drooping Flower. But my desire for revenge was not yet satisfied, and I again led an expedition to steal and murder. Among my victims was a lame man. In his flight I struck him down with my tomahawk and scalped him while yet still alive. When we had returned, telling of our daring feats and showing the scalps we had taken, Drooping Flower was sad, and though I felt brave and proud of what I had done, she refused to hold a scalp in the dance. When I demanded an explanation for her strange action, she told me all, and I learned the story of her youth. I had slain her father, whom she loved and honored. But even this knowledge, though it grieved me for my wife's sake, gave me no remorseful pangs, for I felt an unquenchable hatred against the people who had made my home desolate and caused my beloved friend to perish alone. But when, by degrees, Drooping Flower spoke of her father, describing him and telling his name and his history, I discovered the awful truth, that in endeavoring to avenge the supposed death of my friend, I had murdered him, and his eyes turned upon me their last look as I, with one sweep of my knife, severed the scalp. He had been found by another band of the marauders who had chased my people and captured me, and he was carefully nursed by them. When he recovered, remembering their kindness and knowing nothing of their cruelty to his friends, he remained with them, and marrying one of their daughters became the father of the young squaw that I had abducted and married. For a while the knowledge of my vengeance preyed on my life and darkened its joys, but to mourn was not brave. To look upon Drooping Flower caused me trouble, and I sent her to her mother. And, yielding to a redoubled thirst for revenge, I drew my long knife and bow against my neighbors, for I hated my enemies with bitterness, since they had driven me first to desert and then to murder my friend. This story seemed to be an index pointing to the character of the great chief, whose commands were religiously obeyed. He was then the husband of 8 wives and the father of a very large family. So that's it for this episode. Here, Sarah Larimer, the other woman captured along with Fanny Kelly, was once again saved from the wrath of the Sioux war chief, and then the chief told a story about his battles with Comanches. So in the next episode, we'll hear about what happened to Sarah Larimer and her son after Fanny Kelly found that they had disappeared the night before she was condemned to die for losing the chief's pipe. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.